Great. This talk is part of a very new project on American physical and engineering scientists during the turbulent 1970s. No, we're down here. Now, this is a topic of considerable interest in the history of science and technology right now, often with a focus on countercultural or activist, or what David Kaiser has called groovy scientists. Often with a kind of subtext of looking at ways in which Cold War military industrial complex created the basis for, or in counterintuitive ways supported, countercultural and groovy science and technology. Now, I think this is all great work. To some extent, I've contributed to this literature on physicists interested in levitation and time travel and so forth. But I do think that there's some risk in talking so much about countercultural science and technology of giving short shrift to the ways in which, for lack of a better word, square engineers were being proactive in the 1970s. We're taking the 1970s as an opportunity to do something new and something socially relevant, rather than simply reacting to what was going on in the counterculture. Now, this square groovy distinction is obviously very schematic and problematic, and yet it was a distinction that was both recognizable to and actively being manufactured by many of the historical actors themselves. And if we look at that process of constructing that distinction, and at the same time its deconstruction at the time, we see that yes, there were many areas of alignment between overtly military industrial scientists and engineers and the counterculture in this era, but there were also many areas of antagonism and conflict. What I want to do today is tell a story about that dynamic of alignment and antagonism through a little-known story about solar energy technology featuring a very well-known figure in American science and technology, Jack Kilby. Kilby was the inventor, or co-inventor maybe, of the integrated circuit, the basic technology in every single computer and cell phone in this room and billions of such devices all around the globe, an invention for which he received or shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in the early 2000s. Very, very well-known figure in American science and technology. It's hard to imagine a more square engineer than Jack Kilby. Suburban, patriotic, as this quote from Kilby from a biography written by a friend of his kind of indicates, his presentation itself very rooted in what we might call a sort of prairie sensibility, a long career embedded in the energy industry and the military industrial complex, longtime advisor to the military, champion of the idea that the microelectronics industry should work closely with the military, even if occasionally that came at the cost of a certain amount of profit. As I said, Kilby's invention of the integrated circuit at Texas Instruments in the late 1950s is a very, very well-known story told in lots of different books. What's not very well known about Kilby is his later career. In 1970, he more or less left Texas Instruments to become an independent inventor, ran a one-man engineering consultancy. Now, admittedly, a consultancy whose main client was his former firm, Texas Instruments. He would offer first right of refusal on his inventions to TI, and he would also mediate between TI and various government agencies. Now, most of the inventions that Kilby was coming up with in this period were pretty mundane: telephone answering machine, a reliable flashlight, a theft-proof cash register, and so forth. At the same time, Kilby was becoming interested in pedagogical reform, particularly in correspondence with another former TIer named Jay Lathrop at Clemson University, also with some of the electrical engineers at Texas A&M, Kilby was becoming interested both in sort of lower level education. So for instance, that one at the right is an electronic teaching machine, mostly for elementary school students, but also becoming very interested in reforms to the undergraduate electrical engineering curriculum in universities. And it was through these, So in 1974, in the immediate aftermath of the OPEC embargo, the oil crisis, this pedagogical collaboration between Kilby, Lathrop, and A&M morphed into a collaboration around a new solar energy technology, which, as per usual, Kilby offered first right of refusal on to Texas Instruments. Now, somewhat unusually, this time, TI looked at this technology and said, oh yes, actually we are interested in this, and they began giving quite a bit of money to Kilby, Lathrop, and the A&M group to refine this idea, to patent it, and then within a couple of years to transfer it to a group within TI that went under the code name of Project Illinois, in honor of Kilby's alma mater. Now the idea behind this technology was basically this. They had these BB-sized silicon shot bathed in a fluid medium, hydrogen bromide. Solar photons would strike the silicon shot and create an electric potential which would break down the hydrogen bromide, which would then be stored as hydrogen and bromine. And then whenever you needed electricity, it would be recombined through a fuel cell, providing both electricity and reconstituting the hydrogen bromide to go back into the system. So the main advantage of this is that it answers one of the persistent objections to solar energy, namely, what do you do at night and what do you do when it's cloudy, right? There's a storage for the energy created. There were other advantages, mostly having to do with manufacturability. Obviously, also there were a number of advantages. One, the efficiency of the conversion was pretty low. Two, fuel cells are quite unreliable and expensive technologies. And three, hydrogen bromide is a corrosive and toxic fluid. So there were some concerns, mostly external to TI, about the longevity and safety of this technology. The biggest problem, though, I think, was a business model problem. Throughout Project Illinois, it was envisaged that resolving these kinds of technical issues in a way that would make the Illinois system cheap and manufacturable enough to saturate the mass market would first require marketing small numbers of these solar panels for the very, very high-end real estate market. The evidence, however, was always very thin that people who buy mansions would also be interested in buying costly and rather ugly solar panels and plastering them all over said mansions. Now, if only there were some entity with very deep pockets that could incentivize adoption of such a technology and or backstop losses and or provide a captive market sufficient to allow economies of scale to kick in and the cost of deployment to decline enough to make the economic argument for the Illinois system more plausible. Of course, such an entity does exist, and in fact, it had played a very key role, inadvertently or not, in making Kilby's own invention of the integrated circuit as ubiquitous as it is today. Texas Instruments had played the game of using federal R&D funding and procurement dollars to bankroll development of civilian product lines very successfully. And some of you are of the generation who have used Texas Instruments calculators or speak and spells, and if so, you benefited from that strategy. Of course, the sources of federal funds that TI was most used to dealing with were the military services, particularly the Air Force and DARPA. But even before the OPEC embargo and Project Illinois started, some civilian agencies, such as EPA and NSF, had begun putting more money into environmental technologies. And after the embargo, agencies at the always blurry military-civilian boundary began to follow suit. Most notable was the newly constituted Energy Research and Development Administration, the transitional entity between the decidedly national security-oriented Atomic Energy Commission and the slightly more civilian-friendly Department of Energy. NASA, too, began putting money and personnel into solar power research at the same time it was becoming a more civilianized tool of détente. In other words, even though Project Illinois would have required TI to steer its government relations and R&D infrastructure in a new direction, doing so would in fact orient the company toward the same goals that much of the federal R&D infrastructure was also pivoting toward at the same time. By the same token, this sudden eruption of federal interest in and funding for solar power research created certain dysfunctions. Overnight, the solar power community was populated by new agencies, firms, and individuals who had shaky qualifications for and or little prior experience in the field. Prominent politicians and investors were eager to throw their money and power behind some solar energy technology, but there was little consensus as to which of those technologies merited support. Those who had a technology to promote could perceive incentives to inflate the claims for their own advantages while undermining competitors' claims, and the different federal agencies tasked with sorting through these claimants were themselves competing for scarce resources. In this chaotic environment, it was not even clear which actors might be relevant to Kilby and TI's calculations. Thus, the Project Illinois managers turned to a new tool that had only recently begun percolating out of the world of nuclear wargaming and into the energy industry, namely scenario planning. In 1977, TI commissioned scenario planning narratives for 3 possible scenarios. Development of the technology by TI alone, development with government support, or Texas Instruments takes a partner, meaning a corporate partner or a sovereign partner. As these scenarios predicted and encouraged, senior TI executives began fanning out the solar energy conferences and seeking FaceTime with energy policy officials in Washington and corporate sponsors around the world. By January 1978, TI management seems to have been leaning heavily towards seeking the government support scenario, at least as a first option, largely on the basis of a conversation between George Heilmeyer, an RCA engineer who had just moved to TI after 2 years as director of DARPA, and John Deutsch, the director of research and development of the new Department of Energy. Many of you may remember as Bill Clinton's director of the CIA. For Deutsch, the dysfunctions of the solar community, and especially of the government's involvement with that community, made Texas Instruments' extensive track record of high-quality engineering within the military-industrial complex seem extraordinarily valuable. As he put it to Heilmeyer, quote, "DOE has more money than good ideas. Deutsch is extremely unhappy with the content and management of the DOE solar energy program. The technical sophistication of the managers is low, and he doesn't feel that they have a strategy," unquote. As an antidote to what he perceived as his own department's failings, therefore, Deutsch hinted to Heilmeyer that he had, quote, $25 million in the budget under his direct control for an ARPA-like program, unquote. And in fact, through Deutsch's direct patronage, TI was very soon able to secure a 4-year, $18 million contract from the Department of Energy with very favorable intellectual property terms. So what I would argue here, what was happening here was a reconfiguration over the course of the 70s of considerable parts of the Cold War R&D enterprise, personnel, firms, funding schemes, universities, etc., around R&D projects targeted at civil security issues, energy independence, and to some extent environmental degradation, where procedures and institutions had not yet emerged in those civil security domains. Military industrial actors brought in templates from the national security world. Intellectual property arrangements, cozy relationships between federal agencies and particular military contractors, revolving door hiring of personnel between those agencies and contractors, use of wargaming techniques to argue for particular technological outcomes, and so forth. Now, I think such borrowing from military industrial institutional models made it easier in many ways to create an infrastructure for solar energy R&D in general and for federal support of corporate R&D in particular. Yet this kind of conversion from military to civilian also came with costs, 2 of which were particularly apparent with Project Illinois. First, Cold War organizations were reluctant to dramatically modify their missions to new, unpredictable civilian needs. That meant many military-industrial players in solar power hedged their bets and were quick to look for ways to return to traditional missions. And second, conversion from military to civilian institutions occurred in domains that were already populated by firms, agencies, and individuals that were not previously, or at least not strongly, associated with the military-industrial complex. In general, and certainly in the case of Project Illinois, the former military-industrial actors seem to have had a very low regard for the latter. As mentioned above, Deutsch found the solar energy contingent at DOE subpar in many ways. Similarly, in 1976, Robert Hirsch, director of the Atomic Energy Commission's fusion program and then assistant administrator at ERDA for solar, geothermal, and advanced systems, went public with criticism of his own agency's solar expertise. Quote, "To a degree, I get the feeling that people are reluctant to speak up, like the situation with the king that had no clothes." Now, there's a substantial literature out there that implies that this attitude on the part of military-industrial veterans toward the solar community was part of some conspiracy to blunt solar projects and to promote nuclear energy. And that's in some ways connected to what we just heard about from Jay. However, that's not really the case with Jack Kilby. Yes, Kilby was genuinely outraged by what he saw as the low capacity and presentation of self of countercultural solar promoters, such as the Earth Day organizer and campus activist Dennis Hayes, turned director of the Department of Energy's Solar Energy Research Institute in the Carter administration. So for instance, immediately after the 1980 election, Kilby answered a query about which solar energy officials the Reagan administration should keep. He said, quote, "All of the people who've been involved with the solar program should go." In general, it was my feeling that the level of competence of the people within DOE, and he names people like Hayes specifically, is a couple of notches below those in the DOD. And yet, Kilby was also genuinely outraged when the Illinois project was canceled in 1983, enough to sever his former relationship with Texas Instruments, and in some ways to become a kind of recluse for the final 20 years of his life. Not exactly a hermit, but clearly burned by the experience with Illinois and reluctant to venture again. In other words, Kilby was 100% committed to solar energy, but the only people he trusted to competently participate in the development of that technology were other military-industrial veterans such as Deutsch or his old Air Force grant officer Dick Alberts. And in fact, for a while, Kilby and Alberts were scheming to get the Air Force to use the Project Illinois technology as a power source for their MX missile silos. So, in the end, Kilby, Heilmeyer, and Texas Instruments, they threw their lot in with the military-industrial complex, an array of organizations with deep expertise in the physical science of solar energy, but a thin commitment to a solar economy, or even an economy in which solar played a greater role. And they consistently undermined people like Hayes, who put forward a compelling vision of a solar economy on the basis that people like Hayes did not understand the physical sciences, science of the technologies that would be needed to support such an economy. It's perhaps not coincidental that Illinois' core technology relied so heavily on a fuel cell, since part of what was going on here is that Kilby was engaged in what Matt Eisler has called fuel cell futurism, the continual evocation of the fuel cell as the ultimate clean power source for civilian consumer technologies, such as automobiles, validated supposedly by the fuel cell's use in futuristic military-industrial technologies such as space capsules. But in fact, almost always with the intended or unintended outcome of undermining development of more incremental means of developing less polluting and less energy-intensive civilian technologies. The failure of fuel cell futurism, for Eisler anyway, is that the transition from R&D to manufacturing of fuel cells for widespread use is always deferred. And that deferment is indeed what happened with Project Illinois. By late '82, the Illinois team was projecting something like a $275 to $400 million net negative cash flow for transitioning to manufacturing of the system from 1983 through 1990. So $500 million to $1 billion of today's dollars net negative cash flow for most of the decade. The possibility that Illinois would lead to a corporate gamble of that scale was known all along, but in the late 70s, the odds on that gamble seemed pretty good. It could be hedged with government assistance. By 1982, things had changed. As an in-house analysis put it, quote, "Recent events have changed the energy situation, requiring a careful assessment of energy technology programs. Slower oil price increases, slow progress in the development of alternative technologies, reduced government support for energy technology development." Thus, in September 1983, the program was canceled with about 100 employees reallocated, and Kilby was angrily sidelined and cynically realizing, for the first time maybe, that economic and technical rationality alone would never supply the will to move forward with solar energy unless accompanied by some convergent threat to national and civil security. As he put it in a letter to a friend at the time, quote, "About a month ago, TI decided to abandon the solar energy project there. I have told them that I would like to terminate my arrangements with them by the end of the month. If they are willing to release the patents on the project, I may see if I can do something else with the idea. If they are not, it will die. It may be just as well, as this is not a very good time to be peddling a solar project. We need another Middle East crisis, I guess." So this story, I hope, has some historiographic merit. I think it tells us a little bit about science and technology in the 1970s. But perhaps it also has some presentist implications. Certainly we still live in an era in which large, established military-industrial firms and government uncomfortably inhabit the alternative energy space alongside both environmentalists and entrepreneurs who ground their approach to alternative energy in a deep skepticism about big firms and or big government. And maybe that uncomfortable cohabitation is productive. But perhaps historical narratives like this one can offer new ways of thinking about how the different actors in the alternative energy ecology might dwell on areas of alignment rather than manufacture points of corrosive opposition.